you've got to look at why this war is actually happening and why it's happening now. So I think the best way to approach it for an India audience is to think about it from your point of view. Where does India concentrate most of its armed forces? Punjab, because you have a land bridge between populated Indian and populated Pakistan, and that is a security threat. Well, Russia has 9 Punjabs, and unfortunately for the region, the people who live in Russia's Punjabs are not Russian. So the only way that Russia feels it can be secure is to expand out until it reaches these bridges, these gateways to its core territories, and then hunkers down its forces in the gap just like you do every single day. It's just that they have to go to 9 places, and that means occupying a number of countries with a combined population that is greater than Russia's. So Russia can never be like the United States. It can never be like India. It has to be more like Germany, where it has to have a forward position military stationing policy simply in order to give it what it feels is the minimum necessary security for it to exist. And in that sort of environment, it is very aggressive because from the Russian point of view, this has to be done and it has to be done now. The Russian demography is collapsing, and this is the last time that the Russians are going to have a sufficient number of young people to attempt this sort of effort. So 2 things from this. Number one, there will be no peace talks that matter because the Russians aren't interested. And second, Ukraine is not the end of the story. The Russians are going to push past Ukraine into a number of other countries to their west, which is going to generate a conflict with NATO at some point. We can talk about what that's going to look like. We could talk about what countries are doing to try to stop it, but this is what's at stake here. We're talking about the Russians needing to get under the thumb at least another 140 million people. The first 50 million just happen to be Ukrainian. It can still be a personal project. It can be both. And in the case of the Russians, remember, their demographics started collapsing 30 years ago. So the younger and their educational system collapsed at the same time. So the youngest group of people who actually have a skill set are now in their late 50s. Putin's pushing 70. And the only people at the end of the Soviet era who really understood what was going on were the FSB, the KGB agents, because they had been in charge of the light system with Gorbachev trying to go and drop off Putin as an extension of that line. Well, if you combine the demographic problem with the information vacuum, there's only like 150 people left in Russia who are in their political elite. This is their last window from any number of measures. And so, May 9th, it's going to be a nice little party they're going to have. They're going to celebrate, but they're not going to stop the war. They're going to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. We are now in an artillery conflict, and that is something where Russian equipment and training actually does very well. From a human point of view, it's horrific, but in terms of military capacity, we're in a stage of the war now that is actually playing to the Russian strengths. Russians are, to be perfectly pretty racist, and the Russians have had an immigration policy. They have 2, actually. So in the first one, they just started attracting all of the ethnic Russians from the parts of the Soviet Union that were now independent countries, whether that's Ukraine or Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan. That brought them about 20 million people over the course of the last 30 years. And that's pretty much tapped out. There are very few Russians left anywhere in the world that are not in, say, the European Union now and really don't want to move back to Russia, where their standard of living would be a third of what it is now. The second one is they have an informal program that attracts migrants to do certain jobs, especially construction and agriculture, that mostly taps the Central Asian states, most notably Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Kazakhstan, that has been more successful, but these people are never going to be Russian citizens. They're there as migrant labor, and anyone beyond the ring of the old Soviet influence moving into Russia is a tough call. I mean, low standard of living, very difficult climate, crumbling infrastructure, minimal social services. It's not the sort of place that you move because you want to move up in the world. It's the sort of place you move because there just isn't anything better on offer. And I'd say that even with some of my more dire predictions for East Asia, there's not a lot of people who want to take them up on that offer. Well, at the late Soviet period, particularly once we've got 1989, the Soviet industrial base collapsed. It was never very efficient. And as soon as there was any access to the rest of the world, people went with goods that were cheaper and higher quality. So the entire Soviet industrial base collapsed in itself, even before the Soviet Union ended. Russia at that point was producing roughly 11 million barrels a day of crude. And when internal demand dropped and there wasn't sufficient external demand in order to make up the difference, pressure started building up back through the pipes all the way to the wellhead. And when it reached the wellhead, the Russians had a very simple choice to make. Do we keep running it and risk the entire pipe system busting and having leaks the entire 4,000-kilometer length of the pipes? Or do we shut it in? So they shut it in, but Russia's oil production is in the permafrost, so the pipes go down through that frozen layer. As long as the liquid is moving, that's not a problem. But once it stops, it starts to do what liquids do under pressure and expand a little bit, and it busts the rivets and it busts the pipes. So all of the wells that were shut down in the late 80s, early 90s were shut down forever. We're starting to see that now, starting to see a situation where the pipes are backing up. Refineries are going offline because they don't have anywhere to sell the crude to. No one's picking up their crude to places like Novorossiysk on the Black Sea. And very soon, certainly within 2 months, the Russians are going to have to shut in production, and that production will be gone for decades because the last time this happened in 1988 to 1992, they didn't get it back up online until this last December. So one way or another, the world is going to have to get used to 4 to 5 million barrels per day of less Russian crude later this year. They've expanded a lot of output to new fields since 1990. Most of that work was done by either BP or the Western oil services firms. They're all gone now, so you should expect the remaining Russian output to steadily decline over the course of the next couple of years. Anyway, so for example, the Sakhalin projects that the Chinese are really interested in, they're the most advanced projects in the world producing oil and natural gas for LNG. They're all going to get shut down this year, not because of backed up pipes, but because the people who know how to operate them are leaving. So 4 to 5 million barrels a day going west to Europe goes offline in a couple of months. Another 2 or 3 million barrels a day from Eastern Siberia, most of which goes to China, goes offline this year. Next year needs a new pipeline, minimum 2 years if it's going to meaningfully increase output. Oil sands are not like drilling a normal well. You actually have to mine it. That's a lot of infrastructure. So Canada, really, you're talking about a 3 to 5 year solution to get another million barrels a day out of Canada. Venezuela, after 20 years of, in many cases, deliberate mismanagement, most of the reservoirs have suffered permanent damage. If you were to stabilize Venezuela where it is right now, that's a $10 billion project that'll take at least a year. You might be able to get 300,000 barrels out if you really push it this year, but you're talking about another $10 billion of investment into a country that's sketchy at best at the moment. Iran shows a slightly more positive side. If the sanctions were to disappear tomorrow, Iran would probably be able to bring another 400,000 to 500,000 barrels online within 12 months. But you also need to bring in a huge amount of investment in a country that tends to confiscate investments. The Iranians like to say that the only reason people don't deal with Iran is the sanctions, but that's not true. Iran has the world's second or third most, that's what I'm looking for, constrictive investment regimes. And so even when everything is open, even when you get a country like Italy or France, it really doesn't care about the politics. It's still a very long, hard slog. So you're not going to get 1 million barrels out of Iran in any less than 2 years. That's everybody. I mean, OPEC has minimal spare capacity now in the United States.